Hi, everyone. We want to welcome you to our Creating Trauma Responsive Schools webinar series. This is webinar number 3. I did not say good morning or good afternoon because we have people participating from all over the country. So if it's morning, good morning. If it's afternoon, good afternoon. My name is Kelsey Schmitz, and I am the School Mental Health Lead for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm located at the University of Washington at the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And we're really excited to bring you, again, our third webinar, which is creating a trauma responsive MTSS framework. You want to advance the slides? So we have a disclaimer. Our project is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. As a reminder, we are now halfway through our Creating Trauma Responsive Schools webinar series. Our next session will be on March 18th, and it will focus on Trauma Responsive Schools Implementation Assessment Tool. If you want to register for that one or any of the other webinars, you can do that in the link below. And if you want to watch any of the recorded webinars or have access to the materials, you can also get to those in that link. And Megan, my colleague Megan from the SMART Center, may also be posting links for you in the chat box. Next slide. So just for a review or reminder, for those of you who have been with us up to this point, the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center was funded in late 2018. 10 regional centers were funded across the United States. This center is located in the upper left and serves Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. But I know that many of you are participating from other places across the country, so I encourage you to reach out to your regional mental health technology transfer center. There are 9 other school mental health leads like myself that are a part of each center and are developing materials and resources and trainings that are specific to your region. But we also welcome you to check out the other regions and access the other resources that are put out by the other centers as well. Next slide. So the goals at our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center are to provide direct training and technical assistance on the implementation of mental health services in schools, to build infrastructure and create learning communities, and support educational leaders to promote mental health for all. Next slide. This is our mighty team. That's me. I'm the mental health lead. Megan Lucy, who's my colleague, and Eric Brenz, who's our project director. And then finally, just a reminder that in addition to this webinar series, we have many other resources that you can access from our website. You can get to it, the link there. Megan can also put that in chat for you so it's easy to access. And then if you want to stay up to date on our upcoming trainings and resources and anything else that we create or think is important to push out to the field, we would just welcome you to join our newsletter. And we're now on social media, so if you tweet or you're on Facebook, we would welcome you to connect with us there as well. Next slide. And finally, again, if you've been on these webinars before, you know that we are required by our funder to do evaluations. And at the end, you'll get a link that will take you to an evaluation. We always have a little lower response rate when we host these online events. So we would just really encourage you to take just a few moments to give us your feedback so we can help communicate to SAMHSA the type of support that people are really needing and interested in. It's voluntary and anonymous, and we will end just a few minutes early to give you a chance to fill out those evaluations. If you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A box below. Megan and I are going to monitor those, and we can break into our presenters if it seems like we need an urgent clarification, or wait for a natural break and ask the questions that you may have. If we aren't able to get to your question, our gracious colleagues are more than willing to follow up with any additional questions that you may have. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speakers today, Vivian Villaverde and Pamela Vona, who are at the University of Southern California, and they'll tell you a little bit about the work that they do and the roles that they play, and we'll let them take it from here. We'll give them a chance to unmute. Nope. Okay, let me see if I can fix that. Okay, stay with us.
Thank
We'll
you.
get them on in a minute.
Oh,
there they are.
You have to unmute us.
You're unmuted.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. Yeah, we couldn't control it.
We couldn't unmute ourselves. Okay. All right. So let's get back to the slide we were on. And I will start by introducing myself. I'm Pamela Vona, and I'm from the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resilience, Hope, and Wellness in Schools. This is also a SAMHSA-funded initiative. And our center has been funded for about 20 years now by SAMHSA. And originally, when the work of our center began, we were really focused on developing what are now some of the most commonly used mental health interventions for trauma for the school system. And these may be interventions that you've heard of, like the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, or Bounce Back. And we spent a lot of time developing them so they are in alignment with school practices. And we've done a decent amount of research and evaluation on them as well. And we found that they are absolutely effective at ameliorating signs and symptoms of trauma in students. But what we've realized over the last couple of years is that these programs are most effective, and our students in these groups have the most optimal gains when these practices are embedded in a school system that is trauma informed. And so what we've really focused on over the past couple of years is broadening our scope and trying to understand, how do we get everyone on a school campus to understand the principles of what it means to be trauma responsive and integrate those concepts into their work. And so today's webinar is in alignment with that goal and aim of our center.
So my name is Vivian Villaverde, and I am a clinical associate professor at the Suzanne DeGore Peck School of Social Work here at the University of Southern California. And by training, I am a school social worker. So I was with LA Unified School District for about 10 years, working with high-risk students who are under the care of our Department of Children and Family Services, so they're child welfare kids, and dually supervised by the Department of Probation. And so a lot of the work that I've done has been in collaboration with the Department of Mental Health, Probation, and DCFS as the school representative. And so it's always been those kids who are high utilizers of services and moving around and tend to be exposed to trauma with high exposure and multiple exposure. Both on an acute as well as chronic. So then I moved into the school, the university, and been a part of the Treatment Services Adaptation Center the past 3 years. And we partner a lot with different school districts in Southern California, and we have been able to give them access to a lot of the materials that we have, and we have been supporting them in their trauma responsive transformation in multiple ways. And so that's been my role. And I'm also a TICE trainer, which we've done for our series, the webinar series 1 and 2, and services for students exposed to trauma, and a trainer for that. And with that, I'm going to move into, So we're going to move into our webinar for today, and it's we're titled it Creating a Trauma Responsive MTSS Framework. So just to give you a little bit of a background, we currently are conducting a learning collaborative with the California Department of Education, and we have partnered with a handful of school districts locally, locally meaning California, and we have been discussing and exploring the alignment of the alignment of the MTSS framework with the trauma principles, as well as what the 4 R's that we talked about in Tier 1, which is the being able to realize, recognize, and respond to trauma in order to avoid re-traumatization within the school system. So today we'll talk about that, and we'll share some of the information and some of the things that we're learning in terms of that alignment. Okay. So why a trauma responsive MTSS? For those of you who have attended webinar 1 and 2, this particular illustration is familiar because, again, we're looking at childhood exposures, ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, as well as trauma experiences, whether it's chronic or acute, and we're looking at the proximal outcomes. So right now, what is known is that it does lead to poor academic performance, emotional difficulties, as well as social impairments. But what is even more concerning are the distal outcomes, which is then again looking at the original ACEs studies, which links all that experiences to poor chronic health problems, negative health problems, as well as lower employment, which makes sense because of the proximal outcomes with their academic learning and achievement. And then, of course, higher rate of incarceration. And I think we are more and more aware in terms of the increasing problem that we have with school to prison pipeline. And so with this in mind, we are looking at how could we intervene? How could we interrupt from this end right here on that first arrow? How can we insert the schools? The kids are in our schools for about 6 hours a day. So I think it is worth the investment in looking at how do we break or how do we intervene so that the proximal outcomes could be reversed or reduced as much as possible, then hoping that that would lead to then a different distal outcome. So just to kind of start off, we are presenting, this is a California model, and we're not too familiar, or we don't have there's not a lot of consensus on what a model is, so this is a disclaimer that we're using this as a platform so we can speak about it, but again, we're not endorsing either one, and I think each state has their own model. So this is the California Department of Education MTSS framework. So how they see their MTSS, it's a framework that brings together both RTI2 and PBIS and aligns their supports to help the whole child. And we're looking at, and the only difference, and I think Kelsey pointed out, why is it called RTI2? As far as my understanding of it, this is a California model, and it's just, it is sort of an expansion of the RTI, the original RTI, to include more consultation, collaboration, and family participation and collaboration as well. So the RTI, and I'm going to go back to this, but I'm going to just show you. So in terms of the California, this actually is an RTI of one of the districts that we work with, and they're called APC Unified School District, and they're based in Cerritos, California, which is Southern California. So the RTI is the same as the original one, but what a lot of them have done too is they've also combined a behavioral component to it, but again, the PBIS is also a part of that. So I just kind of wanted to illustrate the tier 1, tier 2, tier 1 being universal, tier 2, a little bit more of it, and then the highest need would be on the tier 3. So I think that particular conceptualization of the RTI is pretty universal on a national level. And then of course, so what it is that it puts it, and I'm going to this slide here. The MTSS basically is sort of the umbrella that pulls everything together. So we're looking at RTI, PBIS, and it's the framework where it holds it. And if you look at it, there's a lot more collaboration, and the system talks to each other and it moves together. It might be moving at different paces, different time, but there's a converging that's going to happen under that MTSS. And so this is, again, a California initiative, their MTSS that they're promoting. So they have the academics, the behavior, the social emotional, and looking at the whole child, but then fostering family community engagement, an administrative, a collaborative administrative leadership, as well as integrated education work framework, and then also looking at not just practices, programming, as well as implementation, but also looking at inclusiveness in the policy that they might be developing, or how can they review and change policy so that it really embraces the collaboration and the integration. So this is the California model, and we just kind of wanted to show it, but again, we are not endorsing it either way. So what is a trauma responsive MTSS or school system? Again, the only reason why we put this school system is that some school districts might not be on the MTSS yet, but I think there is a way to look at the organization, the district as a whole, as a system, and still look at how do you become more trauma responsive. But the focus of this training would be in utilizing the MTSS framework. So where we want to start with this is, how do we align some of the SAMHSA, which again is the funding source for both the MHTTC and our center as well. How do we align some of those principles in looking at the MTSS and whatever it is that we're moving forward with? How do we develop this lens and paradigm so that whatever it is, the programming, the implementation, the evaluation, would go through a trauma-informed lens? And so according to SAMHSA, a trauma-informed system follows 6 guiding principles. The first would be looking at safety, looking at trust and transparency, looking at peer support, looking at collaboration and neutrality, empowerment, voice and choice, and lastly, but again, there's really no order to this. These are the guiding principles, and I think they are, as every one of them is as important as the other, cultural humility. So let's start with the principle of being trauma responsive system and looking at safety. So when we say safety, or when SAMHSA mentions safety, they're referring to physical safety, psychological safety, access to support, and modeling of the calm behavior. So we have to look at the environment. Are we looking at the classroom environment? Are we looking at the campus environment? Or the actual sort of the intangible part of that campus environment, as well as psychological safety? So are we considering all the different aspects of that as we move forward? Is it welcoming? Is there, do they feel that it's a safe space for them so that they can openly talk about some of their challenges, as well as understanding that there will be available supports? And then in terms of access to support, creating that environment where they are feeling safe enough, they can reach out, they can open up and really seek out support, and that there is room to really explore that, and there is room to share those concerns potentially. And not just for our students, but for our staff as well as the families that are coming into your campuses. And then again, one of the things I think that's really important is understanding the importance of every single person in that organization or systems or district understands and are also able to model and foster that calm and safe environment. Okay. The next one would be understanding the principle of fostering peer support. Positive interactions between students are encouraged and acknowledged by staff member. How do we support this? How do we nurture this? How do we encourage this? And then students are given opportunity to practice appropriate peer interactions, and staff members recognize one another's personal strengths and are able to collaborate and model that collaboration. So I think fostering that adult peer support will nurture that student peer-to-peer support as well. So I think we need to look at how we're recreating that kind of environment so that one, we're fostering among staff, among each other, which again strengthens the work that we're doing, but then also how do we model it and foster it within the student population. The next principle that we want to highlight is trust and transparency. And this is looking at not only the classroom, but the entire school, but the district as well. We're looking at, are the expectations clear? Is it predictable? Is there a routine that everybody is aware of? And if there's any changes at all, there's ample time to communicate that, and so that everyone is prepared. Even when we're looking at crisis, is there predictability in terms of the response of the school, the response from the district level as well? And looking at consistency, no matter who might be in, who we're responding to, whether it's a student, a particular student that's familiar, or students that's not familiar, or the families. Is there consistency in the policies, in the procedures, and how we react to situations that arise, whether it's on campus or in the classroom? Okay. And then the next one is collaboration and neutrality. Is there real partnership? Is there a leveling of power? Is there meaningful shared decision-making that takes place within the campus or within the district? And what we want to really highlight when it comes to collaboration and neutrality is, does every single staff, whether it's credentialed staff or non-credentialed staff, is there mutual participation as well as input? I think that's one of the things that we have discovered doing our TIES training in person at different campuses, is that some entities might feel left out and not part of the decision-making power, or does not have the strong enough voice to let, I think, administrators know what they might need in order to move along with the rest of the team. And so that's the kind of thing that we want to look at. Security staff, cafeteria staff, having the same sort of input and voice, and also for not just administrators, but the entire school to know that if we are going to transform and become more trauma responsive, we have to make sure that we're not leaving any one of those groups behind, that we all have to transform together, okay? And then another principle that we want to highlight to consider as you're moving at looking at your MTSS, as well as becoming more trauma-informed, is empowerment, voice, and choice. And this, again, does not only speak to the student, but it's everyone within that system. Is there ample opportunities for success? Are we providing the space for that? Are we engaging stakeholders and everyone in the system to engage in the decision making? Are we encouraging students to identify their own resources? And are we acknowledging success, however small they are or how big they are? Again, as we look at this, we want to look and again focus on students, but we also want to extend this to the families as well as the individuals that are part of that system. And then the last principle that I want to talk about would be cultural humility. Learn about the students' culture, but let them define it. Are we understanding who is in our community, who are in our school? But again, understanding maybe the more known aspects of it, but also recognizing that culture can also be individual, and each family might have their own context and how they express it, how they experience it, and how they use it as a protective factor potentially. And we want to identify strengths and assets of those cultures and tap into them in terms of building that trauma responsive community within our schools and districts. And we want to understand inherent protective factors and coping mechanisms associated with each one of them, and aligning them and tapping into them, and maybe adapting some of them and incorporating or integrating them in some of the programming, other practices that we might have. And this again requires taking the time and getting to know our families and finding out what works within those communities and who are they, who are those that are in our community. And then lastly, being aware of our own biases and its manifestation. Again, I think this is really helpful if we're fostering the collaboration and mutuality among staff, because again, we have to recognize that our staff are made up of different cultures as well. There's diversity there. So we have to look at it as understanding our own and then extending that to the bigger community of our school.
Okay, and so then what we want to talk about is, after we've outlined what all of these principles are, well, what are they intended to do? If we're engaging in practices and have policies that highlight and facilitate those different principles, what ideally will happen? And ideally what's going to happen is we're going to facilitate connection with our students and their sense of safety. And just to remind you why connection and safety matter so much, I just want to, again, for those of you who have been on previous webinars, this will be review, but we wanted to show it just in case there are new people on this webinar. So we know there's 3 regions of the brain involved in the stress response. That amygdala, the green area, is the part that sets off the alarm. But then also engaged in the stress response is our prefrontal cortex, that region of the brain that's involved in all of our higher order thinking, like problem solving, evaluation, organization. And then there's also our hippocampus. And that's a critically important part of the stress response, as it regulates memory and our emotions. And what we've learned is that when students live in situations where they're exposed to ongoing trauma or ongoing stress, unfortunately, this starts to happen. And what this means is that our brains work a lot like a muscle. So if we're constantly in a context where we feel unsafe, that amygdala is going to be working really, really, really hard. But unfortunately, when the amygdala is constantly working, it actually has a negative impact on these other 2 regions of the brain. And so while the amygdala is getting stronger and stronger, it's sending out chemicals that impede the activity and growth of the hippocampus. And when the amygdala is firing so powerfully, it sort of takes our prefrontal cortex, we like to say, offline. And so we know that this is what our students' brains can happen, and this is the adaptation that can happen in their brains as a result of constantly feeling unsafe. So the idea is, by integrating those trauma responsive principles into the practices we're using, we want to reverse that trend. And again, we know that connection, actually those safe and supportive relationships, those actually send out a chemical, oxytocin, which helps to calm the amygdala. And then that allows these other regions of the brain to come back online and operate effectively. And so this is why those trauma principles matter, and why we absolutely want to weave them in to our MTSS. So let's dig in now and combine these 2 things. Earlier, Vivian presented the overall structure of the MTSS and how we can embed PBIS, all of our climate initiatives within the MTSS, and similarly RTI, which has its academic focus. All of those things fall under MTSS, and particularly a trauma responsive MTSS, because look, what's impacted? It's not just academic functioning with the prefrontal cortex, it's also our trauma principles address the child's emotional world. And that is why trauma responsiveness is just such a natural alignment with MTSS, because trauma impacts academics and it impacts the social emotional world of our students. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about a trauma responsive MTSS, we want to frame for what are the practices that are trauma responsive. Well, our center, being that it's focused on trauma responsive practices in schools, we wanted to come up with what we thought are all of the different policies and practices that we consider to be trauma responsive in a school system. What are all of those? And we wanted to do it in a relatively systematic way so that we could feel confident that we have selected policies and practices that truly are in alignment with trauma principles. So what we did was we followed a RAND UCLA appropriateness method, which meant that we brought in 9 national experts on trauma responsive schools. And we went through about a year-long process of identifying policies, of identifying practices, and coming to an eventual consensus on what we think all of those are. And when we did so, our initial framework looked somewhat like this. And we were thinking about it in terms of, well, what are all the different spheres of support that need to wrap around a student in a trauma responsive way? And so this is what it looked like with our targeted interventions, most closely wrapping around that child, moving all the way out to our community and family supports. But then we thought about it a little more and thought, well, we don't want to impose yet another framework on schools. We know schools have framework fatigue. And we thought about it more, and then we realized that there is complete alignment if we just change slightly how we're looking at it. And when we turn those concentric circles on their side, we end up having something that looks very much like our RTI or our PBIS tiers. And again, all of that is completely in alignment with this universal to targeted, to early intervention to targeted practices. And then at each of these tiers, what we wanted to do was identify what we think are trauma responsive within each tier. And again, you can now think to yourselves whether or not these are things that you're already doing. What we want schools to also realize is being trauma informed isn't necessarily picking up a whole new set of policies or practices. Being trauma responsive is putting a trauma lens on the work that they're doing, and also realizing that some of the practices that your school is already engaged in, they very well may be in alignment with trauma principles already. So at the community and family level, what do we need to do to be trauma responsive? Well, we certainly want all of our staff trained to be sensitive to racial and ethnic differences in language and immigration status. As schools, are we partnered with community organizations that are trusted by the different groups within our school? And then finally, and I think this one is critically important, and it's a very unique role of schools, but are we engaging families and even the broader community about trauma and its impact? Because we know we've got those students for 6 to 8 hours a day, but then they're going to go out and they're going to be in the community and be with their families. And how can we make sure that there's some consistency across the different environments they're in over the course of a day? And then we think about things, again, at the school safety level and how we're preventing traumatic and stressful experiences from occurring on campus. So if you're doing a school climate assessment, that is something that absolutely aligns with the trauma-informed principle of safety. Having clearly defined school-wide behavioral expectations, well, that absolutely aligns with PBIS practices.
Mm-hmm.
Do kids feel like there's adequate supervision? What is your threat assessment strategy? How often are you reviewing your threat assessments and updating your approach to threat assessment? What bullying prevention practices are you currently engaged in? Again, that we want to enhance peer support.
Mm-hmm.
And so certainly these bullying approaches.
So I'm just pausing, real quick regarding this. So everything that Pamela said, it's definitely aligned with RTI and with the PBIS, but I want you to imagine looking at all the principles as you're assessing each one of these. Are you looking at it from a safety principle? Is it the safety, the six principles? Are you looking at that as sort of the lens to, as you review, reassess, and realign safety, predictability, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, as well as cultural humility? I know I didn't mention all of them, but you can see where those 6 principles can be at play as you're looking at all these different programmings or things that are already in existence at your campuses, but you're reassessing to see how trauma responsive they are using those 6 guiding principles.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry if I skimmed over that because that really is the essential point here. So I'm glad Vivian emphasized it, which is when we were putting this model together, our central aim was to say what policies and practices align with those 6 principles. So everything we've tried to include here comprehensively, we vetted them for their alignment with those principles. So thank you for making that even more clear, Vivian. This one came out in our evaluation as so critically important. And the more I go out and work in districts, the more I hear this, that we need supports that are specific to our school staff. So what are we doing on our campus to build awareness around the concepts of compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress? Are we creating opportunities on campus for our staff to support one another in ways that are trauma responsive? So again, that principle of peer support. And what resources are available on and off campus for our staff who are working with trauma-exposed students? So we know that all of these trauma-informed principles, they're not just for the students. They're also for how the staff engages with one another and their own sense of physical safety and psychological safety as well. That is critically important to be a trauma responsive system.
Mm-hmm. And just to support that, I think it is such a hard job to build capacity. But if we're not building capacity amongst each other, who are, sort of have the task of supporting our students, we're not going to be successful in building capacity for the rest of our community.
That's right. That's right. And then we know there are practices that are really specific to trauma that schools can implement at that tier 1 level. So universal practices are something like, are all of your staff trained to be able to effectively provide support to students should a traumatic event occur on campus? Are your staff universally trained in that? Have we created discipline policies that understand and take into account the impact of trauma on behavior and academics? Another critically important one, and I think we see examples of this every day in the news, unfortunately. What are we doing with our security and our police on campus? What are their trainings like? Have they received information about the impact of trauma on student behavior? And are they trained to de-escalate situations in a way that avoids re-traumatization of students. So I think that's critically important. And there's a lot of great information on restorative practices and the impact that that can have on school-wide climate. So this would also be a strategy, if you're using it, that absolutely aligns with trauma responsiveness. We also know that there are specific things that we could be doing within the classroom setting itself. So is your school, has it adopted a social emotional learning program or curriculum? Of course, our teachers are always mindful of setting up safe and calm classrooms, but are they doing so with an understanding of trauma, and in particular trauma reminders and the importance of psychological safety? And then when we're working with students at an academic level, you know, how are we taking trauma history into consideration when we're going through the IEP process? All right, and then finally we're up to those, so really those bottom 4 tiers, those are really all tier 1. So that's a lot we can be doing at the whole school level. And really, these top 2 tiers are at the, as you know, in alignment with PBIS tiers and RTI. These are our early intervention. And so when we're doing health assessments on campus, are we including any sort of screening about trauma or ACEs? And I know there's going to be a big movement towards incorporating ACEs into screenings. In fact, here in California, our Surgeon General is moving toward mandating screening for ACEs in schools. But that's an important conversation to have about how we can do that well and effectively and use that information in a way that's supportive to students. And so I know that it's happening here, and I believe it's happening in other states. So it's something that may be on the horizon that we need to be thinking about. And then finally, if we're doing those assessments and we're identifying kids who may be symptomatic at a mild level, who we know have significant exposure, do we have staff that are trained in evidence-based interventions for trauma that can be delivered in the school setting? But I want to make the caveat that training is not enough. There actually has to be a policy in place where that school-based clinician or counselor actually has the time and resources to be able to implement the intervention effectively, and that there is buy-in across the school level for those individuals to be able to implement these groups effectively.
I just wanted to add, I know we're also aware that some schools and resources are different for each district, and some of them might not be school-based. And so we don't only have to look at the school-based services that are in-house. We have to also look at who are we partnering with. And if we are partnering with them and they're bringing their services to our campuses, are they trauma informed as well? Are they in alignment with what you're trying to do and how you want to transform your district or your schools into becoming trauma informed? If you're giving them access and there's full collaboration and partnership, and they have access to your students and to your campuses, I think it's worth having that conversation if they are on board and they're going to be able to align it and be trauma informed as well, or trauma responsive. So that's one consideration.
That's an excellent point. It's in alignment with what we have here at the targeted level, but also it applies to early intervention as well, which is that second bullet there. When we have partnerships, potentially maybe at the tier 3 level, where we've linked with a community mental health agency that's providing supports to a particular student, like Vivian said, have we vetted that organization for their trauma responsiveness and their expertise in trauma, rather than just making an assumption that they're going to get services that are truly evidence-based in trauma. And then finally, when all of the stakeholders are coming together to address student performance, is trauma being woven in to the understanding of the issue and the subsequent strategy use to support that student effectively. So that is how we think these 6 principles of trauma responsiveness align across all of those tiers of support, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So I just want to stop. I think I saw a question. So I don't know if Kelsey or says something on the Q&A just really quickly.
Yep, there was a question that came in about resources for social emotional learning curriculum at the high school level. So I did send the CASEL link for the middle and high school guide, but if you all have additional resources, we could share that as well.
Yep, we are getting there, and I'll be really excited to share all of that with you. So, okay, after we've gotten our frame in mind, it's okay. After we've framed for ourselves, what does it mean to be trauma responsive across all of these tiers, then we need to work together to implement, right? And what I think is most important to understand trauma responsiveness, it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. So the team itself needs to be operating under these trauma responsive principles as well. So when we think about an MTSS team, however you formulate that at your school, I know at a lot of schools we've been working with, they've been using their PBIS team, but also of course integrating others so that we're not working in silos. When we formulate that team, are we considering the way we engage with one another so that it fosters psychological safety? Are decisions made in a clear and transparent manner? Now, when we're engaging in peer support of one another, we always want to assume that our peers have good intentions. And I know that aligns with PBIS principles very much. And are we often recognizing one another's strengths, interests, and contributions? So it's not enough that we do this directly with the kids. It's critically important that this becomes the climate of the MTSS team itself. Are the teams multidisciplinary and at all levels of staff, so that there may be people on campus who are maybe not considered, they don't have as much power, but are we bringing in paraprofessionals and their considerations and their interpretation of things that are happening on campus, and how climate and their perspective on the school climate and how it can be improved. And that's very similar to the empowerment piece as well, making sure there's marginalized voices on campus, including students, including parents, maybe even including community members. Do they have a voice? And then finally, engaging with one another in a way that is also has cultural humility.
Mm-hmm. I just kind of wanted to, I like what Pamela said, and I wanted to reiterate it in terms of, we're not asking you to form another group that would be another team that would be your trauma responsive transformation team, but really look at what you already have. And are all of these principles really in existence, in alignment, or is it integrated, or are they able to incorporate this lens in what they're doing, and really making them aware of how all of this can be embedded in everything that you're going to be doing. And again, there's such thing as work fatigue, and so we don't want to form we're not necessarily endorsing forming another team, but really looking at what you have and how can you make sure that they are being guided by those 6 trauma principles.
Right. So we had the question about resources earlier, and so this is a tool that we want to briefly present right now. And so, as I mentioned, when our team was developing the trauma responsive school framework, all of those tiers that we just walked through, we were doing so because our intention was to develop a school self-assessment to help schools get a sense of how they're doing across a variety of domains. So we partnered with the National Center for School Mental Health in Maryland to create the Trauma Responsive School Implementation Assessment. The assessment is on the School Health Assessment and Performance Evaluation website, the SHAPE system website. And all school districts, public school districts, are already pre-populated into the system. So the registration process is quite simple, but we're certainly available to support you if you do not have an account on the SHAPE system yet. And so there are a number of assessments on the SHAPE platform, but our trauma responsive schools implementation assessment is one of them. And so what you'll see is that the screenshot here shows you the different domains that we just stepped through, right? We talked about whole school safety planning. We talked about whole school trauma programming. We talked about classroom strategies. So what you can choose to do as a team, as a trauma responsive MTSS team, is go on and you can take these surveys one at a time. Say you've decided as a group using mutual decision making that you want to focus on classroom strategies. Well, then you can go in and take the survey and just focus on that. If you want to get a sense of the overall breadth of your trauma responsive policies and practices, then go ahead and take all of the domains at once. And so this is an example of what it would look like if you clicked on the whole school safety planning. You get one question at a time, and you're rating it on a scale of 1 to 4. And then what we're proud of, I think, well, not most, but one thing that we're particularly proud of is that this isn't just an assessment that's going to give you a numerical score without giving you any explanation of what that number means, and more importantly, what you're going to do next after receiving a particular score. So what we've tried to do here is, first of all, define each of the indicators within the domain that you just completed the assessment on. And for those areas where there's a particular need, where you may not have much happening in the way of that area, this feedback report that is tailored to the responses that you just gave, you'll get some concrete recommendations for what would be helpful to move that forward for you. And in addition to that report itself, you can see that the next page after the report is a strategic planning guide that in your MTSS team, you can utilize to create some benchmarks, prioritize the work, and start thinking about how to move specific practices forward. And beyond that, we actually have a resource library on here. And so for each domain, what you can do is when you click on that domain, you will see a comprehensive implementation guide. And what we've done is, with national experts, we vetted as many as we could find the practices that align within each of those domains, and we've given you concrete steps for implementing them moving forward. And so to that example, the question that came in earlier, what are some SEL practices? If you click on the classroom climate domain, all of the resources that we vetted are available in the resource library. So you can click on those resources. Similarly, if you said, well, I want to focus on early intervention, you would click on that tab, and all of the resources that we found are auto-populated there with a guide that gives you information about each of those resources and a recommended strategy for implementing. But of course, we know there isn't just one implementation strategy, and of course, we invite you to tailor that for your school. And again, this is all in alignment of realizing that trauma has an impact on our students, that everyone is recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. And then this third bullet here, critically important, that our school is responding by integrating those trauma-informed principles to create a safe and nurturing school environment. So again, you can see the complete alignment with our PBIS tiers, and we know the impact, the related impact that it has on the RTI as well. And of course, this is really in the interest of making sure we are not re-traumatizing some of our most vulnerable students. And again, the overarching trauma responsive paradigm shift is we're moving away from this student has a problem. What's wrong with them? They're not doing well. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, to what is going on or what has happened.
Yeah, and we want to emphasize in terms of, I think if we keep this lens on an individual basis as the individual practitioner within that school system, that's too much of a burden. And I think we're never going to be able to move from our Band-Aid system of approach in addressing situations, but rather creating a different, a system that would create a bigger change. We need to look at it from that systemic perspective as a whole. How do we move from looking at it from that individual responsibility that there's something wrong with the student, but rather the entire system looking at what is happening to you and how can we, as an entire village, create an environment where we could find out what is really underneath and support and make those changes as we go.
Right. So,
yes, so looking at evaluations, so the next component would be looking at how are we looking at all the programming, the changes, and how are we tracking them? Again, looking at MTSS, one of the more important component of it is being able to look at, how do we know and how do we collect data in terms of, is it working? All the work that we're doing in the framing and the implementation, is it really working? And this really pushes and really encourages the data tracking and also evaluation component of it so that we can review and revisit what we're doing. So when looking at trauma responsive metrics, one of the first things I think that would be really, really good is to kind of look at what are we using already, what's in place. And I think Pamela talked about the TRS-IA, that is potentially one of the things that you could use. But again, we're not endorsing a particular one. We want you to look at what you are already using and how can you use those even more strategically to really collect the data for some of the programming and implementation that you're doing. So looking at the academic, behavior, social, emotional data, and that includes too the attendance data that you already have. What tracking system are you using? And then again, looking at PBIS evaluation tools, and we recognize that Swiss is sometimes embedded in your PBIS, but we've also talked to other districts and they're using other metrics to track their discipline and behavior data. And then looking at your CHIC survey and what other tools do you have and what other tools are mandated by your state. And I think this is the uniqueness of this MHTCC webinar, because a lot of people from different places have access to it. So each state might have their own different mandates on data collection tools. In terms of more trauma-focused metrics, ours, the TRS-IA, again, that is free. It's in the public platform. The only difference is your school or your district will have to create an account, but it's there. And then there's also one called Trauma-Informed School Environmental Scan. Pamela, do you mind talking about that environmental scan a little bit more?
Yes, so this is a really great tool. It was developed by colleagues of ours in New Orleans, in particular Stacy Overstreet, who's a leader in the trauma-informed school movement. And what they have done is they've created an environmental scan that very much maps on to the 6 principles that we presented earlier. And so for each of the principles, there's about 7 to 8 items that you can go around as you walk through your school and get a sense of how are we doing in the area of cultural humility. And the same is true for all of the other of the principles. And so you can look how you're doing on peer support or collaboration and mutuality. And again, use that data to then inform your responses to questions on the TRSIA. The other thing I want to say is that, again, how you evaluate matters as much as what you evaluate. So again, are we evaluating using trauma responsive principles? So when we're completing these assessments, are we weaving in the community? Are we weaving in student voice? Are we weaving in parent voice? We cannot truly assess our trauma responsive efforts unless we're doing so without the voice of everyone on campus who's impacted by it. So again, are we evaluating along the lines and following trauma responsive principles as we do that?
And one of the things that I really want to, I apologize, my throat's drying up. One of the things that we want to stress too is that are we also collecting data and evaluating our own staff? Because I think if we're going to embark in this journey and this work, which is intensive, are we looking at how are we going to be able to support our own staff as they do the work? And so there are two evaluation tools that you could use. There's the compassion fatigue survey, that's more on the individual level. And we're not encouraging the use of it so that administrators can collect it, but you can actually use it for yourself so that you can also make a plan on an individual basis. And how do you fortify yourself and how do you address your own needs as the staff, and collectively maybe develop some supports and some programming that would continue, that would organizationally support each of the staff in order to engage in the work. And then there's another survey that's just been recently developed. There's actually a secondary traumatic stress organizational survey that's been developed so that you can look at the entire organization and the awareness in terms of the stress level and the responses and the supports that they have for their employees and the staff. So that's called the SCS organizational level. And there are many others out there, but I think just like Pamela has said, we need to be intentional in how are we combining some of the pre-existing evaluation tools that you have and what the gaps are and how you want to enhance it in terms of your evaluation and data collection. For again, the purpose of it is for us to be able to review and look at our implementation, our practices, so that as we're going back, there's sort of a cyclical movement to this, like as we're reviewing our framing, is it data informed? Are we basing it on some of the collections, the data collections that we have, and understanding the gaps and the strengths so that we can reframe, so that we can review our implementation and development as well?
And so one thing that we'd also like to do is just quickly give you a preview of what the SHAPE system looks like. I saw in the chat that Kelsey shared the SHAPE system link. And so what I'm going to quickly do, sharing the screen, is just give you a virtual tour. Okay. All right. So quickly, I'm going to go into the shapesystem.com. There it is. All right. Let me just make it bigger now. I can, get it. All right. So here it is. This is what the landing page looks like. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to sign up yet, you'll do so here. But once you have your account, you'll just log in, and I'll just do mine really quickly. And this is my fingers. All right. So as I mentioned, there are quite a few assessments on here. And you know, you are certainly, depending upon your school's needs, you know, encouraged to complete all of them. But I just want to point out that you don't have to go through all of these other assessments to get to the trauma responsiveness one. You can completely just jump into the system and choose that assessment if that's what you want to focus on. And so, as I mentioned, you can complete all of these domains at one time, or you can choose to select one because that's what you're wanting to focus on. So you would say take survey, and let's just go in and let's do it as if we're not doing so great on things. So there's really no approach here. There's no approach here. This is one of our shorter domains, and nothing here. And then, as I mentioned, what will pop up is, oh, we can then view our report. And as you see, we weren't doing so well. We got some recommendations based on where we said we weren't doing well, which was each of those. And then, of course, we can work together in our teams to use that strategic planning guide. What I also wanted to point out was the resource library. And again, if you want to focus on other aspects of mental health in your school, there's a link for that. But if you want to focus on trauma responsiveness on its own, go ahead and click there. And as I mentioned, there's a tab for each of the domains. And so let's go ahead and do trauma programming. Well, then pre-populating, there's 28 out of 110 resources that we vetted there. And then what you can do is in each of the domains, the first thing that'll come up is a trauma programming guide. And again, what it does is it comprehensively spells out what we considered to be all of the indicators within that domain. And then subsequently, for each one, we've identified what we consider to be the best practices as it relates to that domain. And like I said, we did our best to provide you with an implementation approach that was vetted by experts, both at the academic level, but also experts who had boots on the ground who do this work. And so we encourage you to use this as a way to think through, and when you're completing that strategic planning guide, grab this guide at the same time so you can be cross-referencing with it. And then again, you have access to all of the resources within here. And so classroom strategies, we have a number, creating trauma-sensitive classrooms, discipline. So again, we want to make sure you have resources that align with all of the different domains that you want to focus on. So I want to be able to answer any questions. We wanted to give about 10 minutes for questions before you have a few minutes to complete your evaluations. So please let us know. And we can just quickly jump back into the PowerPoint and finish. And then we can go with, all right, you want to just finish?
So as I've said earlier, we looked at the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences and trauma experiences, and where we want to place our schools in that early intervention, catching them during their school age years so that we can really make an impact on the proximal outcomes and support academic achievement, social-emotional wellness, and ultimately school success. And then again, we want that to have that reverse impact on the distal outcomes and experiencing better health outcomes as an adult, stable employment, again, education, educational success leads to stable employment. And again, the last thing that we want to do is really impact and lower that incarceration when interrupting the school to prison pipeline. So as we look at the role of the school and why this should matter to us, those who are engaged in the educational system, is because we have these kids in our care for about 6 hours, and this is the best place where we have a captured audience where we can actually make a difference. And again, as a school district, if you did our webinar 2 in terms of webinar 1 and 2, in terms of what is, as a school, what are our deliverables? And those are really supporting school success and higher test scores, high attendance rates, as well as higher graduation rates. If we don't look at this and if we don't provide those additional supports that our students need, it's going to be really, really hard for us to meet those deliverables as well. And with that, we want to open it up with some question and answer or Q&A.
So I'm just responding to a question that came into us just about where that website is again. It is theshapesystem.com, and we have really tried to make the registration process quite simple, but if you run into any issues during registration, please, you have our emails. Feel free to contact us so that we can make sure you have access to the system and are able to do what you would like with it.
Thank you, Pamela and Vivian. I just want to share a few of my takeaways and maybe give people just some additional time if they're still pondering about a question that they want to ask. So lots of takeaways from this presentation. First and foremost, just there's a lot that we can be doing at Tier 1, and the concept of taking a systematic approach as opposed to trying to think that we can do this one individual student at a time. That there's a lot more we can do with that approach. Also ensuring that partners are trauma informed. So, you know, the community members and programs that are coming into our schools, ensuring that, you know, everyone that interacts with our kids and staff have these same values, that you don't need an additional team. And I see this a lot in schools and districts that might have a PBIS team and a climate team and a trauma-informed team and a discipline team, that this doesn't, you don't need to create another team, that this just becomes, use your existing teaming structure. Lots of free resources and tools that are out there for people to access, as well as nice concrete steps that have been created. And then the emphasis on family, youth, and community voice as just a critical aspect of this work as well. So those were just a few of my takeaways, and we'll see if I talked long enough to see if anybody else had any additional questions. I don't see any, but again, you all know how to reach out to us if you process this a little more, or maybe go back and share this webinar with your team and have some additional questions. We would encourage you to reach out.
And I just wanted to add, thanks for bringing that up, Kelsey, in terms of the teams. I think too, as you're looking at it, whether you have one team or multiple teams, especially if you have multiple teams, I think it's really worth coordinating and collaborating amongst those teams to make sure that you're going to converge somewhere, that there's going to be an intersection somewhere in the future, because if they're only going to be parallel, I think in terms of creating that school district or school, whole school transformation, it's hard to do that when everybody has different mission and vision and goals. So making sure that those multiple teams are going to converge or sharing the same lens, which is as much as possible the trauma responsive lens, would really be helpful in making it converge somewhere in the future.
I think
So these aren't questions, but more comments. Thank you so much. As a former school counselor and current professor, I'm interested in MTSS and trauma. This was excellent. Thank you. Absolutely love your tiered intervention and integrated focus using a systems approach. Great points about not needing to create a new initiative or new team. Align and integrate what you already have, and then build capacity to facilitate, to fill gaps.
Yep. And again, I mean, I think that's why trauma responsiveness is really so in alignment with MTSS because it is that umbrella that addresses social emotional needs and academic needs. You can't address trauma without looking at both because both are impacted by trauma. So it really is that same natural alignment, bringing together RTI and PBIS under one system. Again,
All right.
Want to thank you all and wish you luck on your trauma responsive MTSS journey. And certainly as you learn things, please stay in contact with us. We are just as much interested in learning from your experiences as we hope that you learn from our experiences being out there in the field. And also keep in mind that this is not a 1 year agenda. This is truly a journey. 3, 4, 5 years. So do not get discouraged and take it slow.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to add to that, having the MTSS as a cycle, there's a framing, implementation, and evaluation. You will make mistakes, or you might have some programming that are not going to be successful. I think that's okay. I think part of it too is that if we don't accept that not everything that we're going to do is going to be 100% successful, it's going to be 100% good fit, I think we need to acknowledge that it's a work in progress and it's a journey. We might not get it right the first time, but that's why we're going to evaluate it. We're going to keep track of what the impact is so that we can review and then adjust as needed. And that is part of that cycle. That's all natural. That's part of the journey.
That's right.
And then I'm moving the slide for you, Kelsey.
Yep, and I think Megan has put the survey in the chat box. So given that we have a few extra minutes, we'd like to ask you all a huge favor and share your positive feedback or not so positive feedback. It's really helpful for us to have as a team and also helpful for us to communicate to SAMHSA what's needed out in the field. So as a reminder, our next webinar will be March 18th. And Vivian and Pamela will be back with us to do a deeper dive into the tool that they talked about today, the Trauma Responsive Schools Implementation Assessment Tool. And give us a few days, but we'll have the recording up and posted along with the other recordings on the registration link and webinar series page. And then again, just the next slide on evaluations. This will also come to you in your follow-up email. And if you listened with multiple people from your school or district, we would just ask your help in making sure everybody who listened fills out the evaluation. And so if you didn't capture it or have time to share that link with everyone that's sitting with you today, you'll get an email in a few days that'll have the evaluation link in it as well. Next slide.
Cool. I think is that our end? Oh, no.
And then just a reminder of how you can get in touch with us, how you can access additional resources, how you can share what your needs are and get some support and technical assistance. Reach out to myself or Megan, visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, check us out on social media. And next slide. And just a big thank you. Thank you to our participants for taking time to join us today. Thank you for our amazing colleagues, Pamela and Vivian, for their outstanding presentation and sharing the work that they are so focused on there and the resources and tools that they've been creating. We really appreciate your time and all the work that each of you are doing across the country for our kiddos, our school staff, and families. So with that, I think we will just end the webinar here and look forward to talking with you in March. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.